Perfect. Well, it is 12:02, so let's go ahead and kick things off. Thank you everyone for joining our webinar today, Tackling Multicultural Marketing Like a Pro, brought to you by the Diversity Movement. I'm Kayla Kovac-Galton, the Curriculum and Project Strategist at the Diversity Movement, and I'll be handling the logistics for this event. Our webinar will be facilitated by Walk West's Director of Brand Strategy, Lizzie Newton. Walk West is a full-service marketing agency based in Raleigh, North Carolina, named one of the fastest growing companies 3 years running by Inc. 5000. Just a quick note before we begin, conversations around diversity, equity, and inclusion, especially those that require us to be vulnerable, can also make us feel uncomfortable. We want to allow compassionate and critical dialogues that lead to personal exploration and growth. If we're not comfortable being uncomfortable in these conversations, we're not doing it right. If you're referencing this webinar on social media, please use the hashtags TDM webinar and diversity and inclusion, and tag the Diversity Movement on LinkedIn, Instagram, and Facebook. Now I'm going to drop out of sight and let our host take it from here. Lizzie, the mic is yours.
Thank you so much, Kayla. Thank you to all who are joining us today. I'm Lizzie Newton, as Kayla mentioned. I'm the Director at Brand Strategy at Walk West. A little bit of background on myself. I bring about 12 years experience developing holistic campaigns for an array of audiences and brands. So why are we here? What are we going to talk about today? Over the next hour, we will be covering several facets of multicultural marketing, including why multicultural marketing isn't just changing your imagery or your language for that matter. How true multicultural marketing is about shifting your targets and your thinking, hiring those with different backgrounds, perspectives, cultures to push how you and your company approaches projects. Why it is important to know your audience, from the impact of Gen Z on your marketing mix to how to target countries outside of your primary location. We'll also review examples of how brands have alienated or offended potential clients. I'll share some case studies for both brands that got it right and brands that missed the mark, and we'll talk about how and why. What to do in the near term and long term to fix marketing mistakes for your company, and how to make real changes to your marketing that will authentically reach multicultural audiences. I'm excited to chat with our panel of experts today, Bob Osmond, Shelley Willingham, and Sharon Delaney McLeod. Together, they're a pretty impressive force of nature, and between them have experience in B2B and B2C marketing, digital strategy, diversity, communications, public relations, and branding, which is part of the reason why I'm going to ask each of them to introduce themselves and tell you a little bit more about what they do and how they approach multicultural marketing before we lean into some of the questions. So first, Bob Osmond, President of RacePoint Global, which is an integrated PR and communications agency based in Boston, Massachusetts. Bob, can you share a little bit more about your background and what multicultural marketing means to you and your industry?
You bet. Well, thanks, Lizzie, and thanks everyone for joining, and hello, fellow panelists. So yes, you mentioned RacePoint's an integrated marketing firm, and I have been in the world of brand building for about 3 decades or so. And, you know, a lot of the work I've done has been in the technology space, which I will acknowledge right from the get-go has had its own fair share of challenges as it relates to diversity and inclusion. But, you know, one of the things that's been really interesting is that in the early days when I started in tech communications, the focus was so much on sort of what we did and how we did it, and so much less on the why, to quote Simon Sinek, but also who we did it for. And so, you know, I think that ultimately technology has a massive role to play in improving people's lives. I mean, we see it every day. But again, we've forgotten, I think, all of the people and looking at all of the people whose lives we impact. So for me, multiculturalism and multicultural marketing is really about remembering that not everyone that we're speaking to looks like me. And to Lizzie's point, that's not just about changing pictures and some of the language, but it's about understanding the motivations, the different channels, the different stories that are told within those markets. So I think it's about using brand to connect with people so that they see themselves in your brand. And that's the key to success in building any brand, is that your target market, they have to see themselves in you. And so there's a business imperative to do it. There's also, for me, just a basic human imperative to do it. And I know we'll talk a little bit about this later, but the lines between B2B and B2C have blurred a lot, because ultimately I think we're all participating in culture. Brands have a big impact on culture. And so this notion of being a B2B brand that's sort of hiding in the background just doesn't exist anymore.
Absolutely. And I love how you stated that too, because it's not just about an industry or the size of a business. It's across the board, and the implications are the same. Absolutely. Next, Shelley Willingham, Vice President of Business Strategy at the Diversity Movement. The Diversity Movement, or TDM, as many of us fondly refer to it, helps guide businesses to embed diversity, equity, and inclusion into their companies through data-driven, technology-enabled solutions. Shelley, can you tell us a little bit more about the Diversity Movement and how communicating with multicultural audiences and executives factors into what you do? I think we've got you on mute, unfortunately.
Talking to myself. Okay. The diversity movement, yes. So we are definitely focused on a movement. We are trying to change the world. We are going to change the world. And we're helping corporations understand the importance of having an inclusive environment. And a lot of times, most of those conversations start and maybe stay around HR. And it's so important to understand and make sure that those messages are filtering through your entire organization. And so with multicultural marketing, it's so crucial, because if you have this, you've got this great DEI strategy at the top and everything, you're doing all the things that are right, you're hiring the right people. So it seems you're, making sure that people feel comfortable when they come to work. But if those messages aren't resonating to your consumers, to your audiences, then it's going to fall flat. My career started in the multicultural marketing space. I'm not going to say 3 decades. I'm not as old as Bob. But long ago. Just jokes, Bob. I love you. So it started a long time ago. But basically, I was helping corporations understand the purchasing power they were missing out in different segments. And so a lot of times when people think about multicultural, they think about ethnic diversity. But I expand that definition to include, people with disabilities, sexual orientation, all of these groups that need to be seen and need to be heard and feel like they need to be included. And so when I think about multicultural marketing as a whole, that's what that is. It's making sure that your audience is heard, is seen, and you are talking to them in their language without using stereotypes or being offensive.
Absolutely. I love that too, because I think so often when we think of multicultural marketing, we think of the end product, but it really starts internally as well. And so your perspective in both is such an important piece of what we're going to be talking about today. Last but not least, I have Sharon Delaney McLeod. She's a partner and VP of Professional Development at Walk West. Sharon, how have you approached multicultural marketing throughout your career as a journalist, PR professional, TEDx speaker, and professional development coach?
Oh, sorry. Of course, I forgot to turn off the, excuse me.
She's important.
Yeah, well, you know what I did? I turned off the notifications on the computer and forgot to do it on my phone. Pardon me. It's an interesting thing because, Lizzie, I'd like to say that as a journalist, we started thinking about this a long time ago. And when I was out in the field writing my stories and coming back to the newsroom and putting them together, we had to make sure when we were actually shooting video of the stories that the video reflected the community in which we served. Mm-hmm. End of story. I mean, that was a direction from the news directors, from the general managers I worked in 6 different markets. And so this was many years ago that we were taught, you must reflect the community you're serving. And I grew up in Miami. And if you even look at newscasts in Miami, it's really interesting to see that some of the top newscasts are completely Spanish language newscasts, because that reflects the community in which they serve. Now, when I transitioned to a PR and marketing role after leaving journalism, we also decided early on, when we're shooting videos on behalf of our clients, we're really still storytellers. I'm still telling stories just on behalf of my clients. Are we reflecting their audiences? So it's always been a part of our internal conversation, but I'll tell you the piece that I've learned the most in the last year. And I'm going to borrow a phrase from one of my favorite clients whose name is John Samuel. His favorite saying that he coined is proximity builds empathy. Let that sink in for a moment. Proximity builds empathy. You can't start to truly understand diverse people without spending some time to understand and learn from them. So, John, my friend, has a visual impairment. He's legally blind. And so, as a marketer, oh my goodness, all the things I'm now learning from as far as, and Shelley mentioned it, diversity and inclusion and equity is a much broader stroke than we're thinking. And so, are you doing alt text on all of your social media images? Are you doing closed captions on every single video? That is true multicultural marketing in my book.
Absolutely. It's so significant. And Sharon and I have the privilege of working a lot together with some of these campaigns to fold in these other elements. It's so important beyond just, again, imagery and language pieces, but what are you doing day to day that actually opens and to multi and different facets of an audience. So it's pretty significant. All right, with that, I will start to kick off some of the questions. We're gonna, however, open with a poll first. So Kayla, can you please put that on the screen? The question that we're gonna ask is, do you have a multicultural marketing strategy? While you guys take a moment to answer, it's important to remember that culturally diverse groups make up about 40% of the US population. By 2044, according to the US Census Bureau, multicultural audiences will comprise the majority. It's a $3.2 trillion industry and spending power. That is a huge and important, significant market. No matter if you're targeting customers or other businesses, you can't risk offending your audience, which is why we're here today. So polls are coming in. We're pretty split. We have about 37% at yes, 40% at no, and I don't know at about 23%. So we will circle back to this towards the end of the webinar, but I want you guys to hold on to what those kind of results are and what you can do about it. Hopefully we can provide you with some tools and approaches. Thanks so much for answering. It helps us understand honestly where you all are in your multicultural marketing planning and kind of direct some of our questions today. So first and foremost, we're going to start at the beginning. We're going to define multicultural marketing. I want to get our panelists' perspectives on the state of the industry now. So we're all looking at it from different perspectives. What does multicultural marketing mean to you in your industry? Shelley, will you kick it off for us?
Sure. So I think, we mentioned a lot of this in our intros, kind of what we think multicultural marketing is about now. And it's interesting that there's some conversation in this space about changing that language because it was pretty much maybe focused around minorities. And now the minority is becoming the majority. And so there's conversations about, well, multicultural marketing really isn't about minorities. However, even though the numbers are, you can't deny them, you just read those statistics, they're very compelling. But as we think about bridging the two together, so multicultural marketing, diversity, inclusion, equity, obviously there's not representation where there needs to be at certain levels within organizations. And so with that being said, there probably is not going to be representation of people in a marketing arena that are creating ads, creating messaging to reach out to communities that they serve. So wanting to look like communities that they serve. So I think when we think about multicultural marketing, we need to expand the definition. And again, just think at a very base level, how do I make sure that the communities that I'm serving, that I'm trying to reach, that I'm trying to connect with, feel seen and feel heard by my message, by my brand?
Bob, I know you have a global perspective on this. What would you add based on your experience in crafting stories and strategies from this lens?
So I think, if I put on my B2B hat, I actually think, obviously, the key to designing really good products is that you're designing those products with inputs that take into account multiple experiences. And I think, historically, maybe we haven't done a great job of that. But even more broadly, I think you need to think about the talent that you can attract to your organization. So whether that's technology talent, design talent, marketing talent, and also the right partners. And so this whole notion, I know we keep coming back to this idea about people seeing themselves in your brand, but it's critically important, not just from an end user perspective, even assuming B2B is ultimately B2B to C in many ways, but how do you build out an ecosystem of talent and partners who can actually help you create products and solutions that will be useful and helpful to a broader range of people. So I know that's maybe a slightly more holistic view of it, but I think that a lot of the challenges we have, what is that old expression? Nothing kills a bad product like good advertising. If you're not designing ultimately for a broad base of users, then it doesn't matter how good your marketing ultimately is if it doesn't speak to that. So to Sharon's point about thinking about ableism in terms of product design, it's a great example. I mean, it might be just showing a person who is not cited in an advertisement or marketing materials. If that product isn't designed for them to use, then you have a broken system. So I think with a lot of the things that we're talking about right now, and obviously there are many conversations happening, you cannot solve any of these problems with just tackling one thing at a time. We have to think systemically, because these are systemic challenges, no matter how we look at it.
Yes, I love that reference to an ecosystem, because it's not just an ad having that element and that perspective in multicultural marketing. What does that journey look like? If you're putting out an ad with translations, is your landing page, does that have translation services as well, and alt text, and reach that audience? So looking at the whole scope is so significant and important. Thank you so much for these definitions and perspectives. Marketing and advertising must communicate inclusively, because customers in different cultures have different values, experiences, expectations, and ways of interacting. You've each touched on this a little bit, but why is multicultural marketing so important, and how can you present the business case to your organization as to why this is significant? Sharon, can you start us off on this one?
Sure. I want to make sure too that, and it's really adding to the previous point and then building upon that. It really starts organically. It can't be just the end user. I think that's what Bob was saying too, in that we have to begin from the very genesis of what that story is, what that message is that we're trying to do. And when I put it into real world terms, it's, for example, if we're putting together a video project for a brand that wants to reach a broad audience, we are starting from the very beginning with casting the people in the video. And we have to walk a very fine line between inclusion and tokenism, right? We want to make sure we're not just adding the one token ethnic diverse or gender diverse or whatever it might be, or ability diverse. We have to make sure that it really is an authentic representation of who our audience is. And sometimes it requires educating our clients. We do get pushback, but as professionals, there's a reason they hire us as marketing professionals to say, look, if you want to be truly inclusive of a broad audience, let us help you do that. And so it's everything from the planning of who's in the video, how we're writing the scripting, what kind of translations are available for it, all of it. I mean, it's a really much larger project than what you really think, and the storyboarding and what does that look like, and how will this land with everybody who might have a chance to see this. And so those are the conversations that we're having, that I think if you who are attending this webinar are a solopreneur, a small business, really start from the very beginning and think about all of that as you put your marketing pieces together.
Thank you so much. What about Shelley? How do you feel about this topic, and how to make that business case for if you don't have a multicultural marketing plan?
So as I mentioned earlier, that's kind of where I started my career in this whole diversity and inclusion space, was in multicultural marketing and connecting with corporations on the purchasing power of diverse groups and how they were missing out on those segments. And in a lot of cases, they didn't really even know that there was so much purchasing power in these different segments that we have. And so you have to attach, of course, the business case, I think, to everything. It is the right thing to do as well. But people lose focus and people, the excitement kind of goes away. Because if that were the case, then these conversations about diversity and inclusion that we've been having for over 20 years, we wouldn't be where we are right now. Now there's like a resurgence, right? There's something that happened and people are excited about it, or people are concerned about it, and we have to do something about it. But that attention will wane. So when I think about in 2007, when the market crashed, I lost several clients that were big on diversity and multicultural marketing because, oh, wait a minute, that's no longer a priority because we've got to get something else straight. So unless you can really attach it to the business case and make it a part of your overall business strategy, it's really not going to stick. And you want to have something that's going to land. So I think it's basically making sure that you understand, again, the community that you serve. You understand and have the right people around the table having the conversation. If everybody sitting around the table looks the same, has the same experience, how in the world will you possibly be able to create a campaign that speaks to different audiences if you don't have that proximity, right? Proximity builds empathy. So putting all of these pieces together, I think, is so very important. And to Sharon's point, it's a process. It's more than just saying, oh, we need to translate this into Spanish. Let's pop it in Google, see what pops out, throw it up there, and it's totally wrong. Or we put in, the black girl here and the black boy here, whatever that looks like, just to feel like you're checking a box. You have to be authentic. You have to make sure that you have, again, the people around the table that are having these diverse, innovative, creative conversations that can help you paint the right picture and tell the right story.
That's a great point. Bob, can you build a little bit off of what Shelley's saying in your experience as well in this?
Well, I think, it's never monolithic. And I think we have a tendency to oversimplify, and we bring this sort of box checking mentality. Oh yeah, well, we check that box because we put the person who looks like that in this collateral or whatever it might be. So there's still something to be said for segmentation in terms of psychographics and all of that. But, I think where we were maybe 10, 15 years ago is we didn't even factor in the purchasing power of what is soon to be the majority population, because it wasn't a shared experience. I mean, the people, going back, people designing the products, the people marketing the products, all had one experience, coming from places of privilege largely. And how could they? I mean, they're living in that echo chamber and not actually, because, hey, they were making money. But we've recognized over time that, and we're being pushed, and I know we'll talk about Gen Z a little bit, but it's not just Gen Z, it's millennials, and then that behavior has bubbled up to Gen X and others. But there's an expectation that the corporation, that business, needs to stand for more than just making money. Now, having said that, because it's such a massive opportunity, it is ridiculous to not be taking steps beyond, cosmetic steps to address those opportunities. A long time ago, I worked with a healthcare IT company, and they were really all about improving access to healthcare and improving the delivery system and also improving outcomes. But the CEO always said, no margin, no mission. So you got to make money in order to continue to push things forward. And I think now what's been laid bare is, and consumers are smart, they can see which companies are putting a veneer or a facade over who they really are and what they really do, versus those that truly will make the commitment to showing up as an inclusive or a multicultural player in the space.
Yes, and that's the impact of social media for that reason, that live time kind of call out, pushback networking. It's actually the perfect kind of segue into where we're headed next, which is I'm going to actually share my screen and we're going to look at a couple examples where people got it wrong, and have a little bit of a conversation around that. So bear with me and I will share this in just a moment. So if you all can see this, we're gonna look at a couple different things with this. I've got a couple examples that then we can talk about as a panel, in both language, imagery, and then the business impact of what some of these decisions did. We'll start off with this first screen, which is both Bic and Mr. Clean. It's a perfect example of what you guys were just talking about it's not just visual representation, right? This is just checking a box. There's a diverse imagery here. However, paired with the language, it has a very different meaning and a very different impact there. So Bic from 2012, look like a girl, act like a lady, think like a man, work like a boss. And Mr. Clean with this Mother's Day, get back to the job that really matters. There's not a whole lot that I can say about these. I think they kind of speak for themselves, frankly.
Can I just,
Anybody?
can
Yeah,
I just
please.
add as the only male on this panel, and I'll probably be accused of being a beta male for saying this, but the last thing we need is more people thinking like a man. I'll just tell you that right now.
Yes. What's interesting about this too is the big ad specifically ran in South Africa, and so it's an interesting kind of study of that global decision making and the pushback that actually had on Bic. They posted a very public apology and removed the ad completely from circulation. So it is an interesting kind of play in that. I'll move to the next one. This is another example of what language matters. Nivea from 2017 with White is Purity. And then again in 2011 with Recivilize Yourself. Really horrific language selections, and an example of what happens when you don't put in place some of these procedures for diversifying your team, so that you can catch things like this and not put it to market again and make the same mistake. And we'll talk a little bit about that as well. But this example I think is interesting because it's very clearly defined as something that should have been caught by your team before it even went to market, for a lot of different reasons. I will pause for a moment if the panel has any thoughts or considerations here.
I can't believe in 2017 that was still being put out there.
Yeah.
The tone deafness is extreme.
It is. Yes. Dove is another example. Beauty products are an industry, and we'll see some examples of this that repeatedly kind of struggles with this in a way that frankly they should have learned from by now. Dove in 2014 with this nourishing lotion for normal to dark skin. So this is an example of some very specific language selection, right? It's not just the ad that was amiss, but placing normal as a comparative to dark skin is just, it's a completely inappropriate use of that as a brand position, let alone a product. From 2014, we go into the business impact 2017. So what's interesting about Dove as a case study from a marketing perspective is that between 2014 and 2017, they launched a campaign that was centered on inclusivity called the Real Women campaign. And they doubled their actual revenue from that period from 2.5 billion to 4 billion in a span of about 3 years. However, during that time period, they consistently put out ads that misfired and caused revenue to drop for them. And so while they were, as a company, saying and taking a position of inclusivity, they also had this counter narrative of missing it in their advertising and alienating their consumers with the representation and the way in which they chose language pieces for it. And so Dove is a really interesting example of what that business impact was, and how consumers began to seek other brands because of it. They sought them out initially because they were being inclusive, and then they switched over to pushing against them and finding different alternatives because they continued to have issues here. They had a 3.5% revenue drop from 2017 to 2019. Consumers left the brand, which is interesting, and why this is a really significant topic that we're talking about today. This is another one of the business impact. This is H&M, and that is the right response. It is pretty appalling. But in terms of the business impact of what this did for H&M, there was a huge boycott H&M social campaign that came out with this. This is an example of a brand that had had problems with DEI in the past. And so it was not just a singular moment for them. It was something that was a pattern of behavior that really hit the pinnacle of it, and shares fell after this kind of social movement to boycott H&M from $4.64 to $2.62 in the span of a year, and has held since. So it's this kind of moment of social reckoning where changes were not made and consumers demanded change. So it's an interesting study there. This is Dolce & Gabbana from 2018. This is another study of a business impact. So Dolce & Gabbana, an Italian fashion brand, trying to really capitalize on the luxury good market in China. They were, this video, and if you have a chance, look it up, was released to help lift their, and kind of promote their fashion show that was coming up in China. It's the voiceover is what's so offensive, as well as the imagery in this. They intentionally have a very mocking voiceover, as well as intentional mispronunciation of chopsticks. The Chinese market on social media, again, did a huge push and ended up being such a market call that they ended up canceling the show. It was shared with a hashtag 870 million times by Chinese consumers, and actually forced a pretty solid withdrawal and having to reconfigure and put out a statement in response to this. So again, an example of social media being a place where these conversations can happen. This is Intel, and this is an example of imagery and the significance of what happens and why you need to review and have a multicultural marketing plan. So multiply computing performance and maximize the power of your employees. We'll leave that there. And then Sony in 2006. So again, it's the combination of language, internal process of reviewing, and the imagery and diversification there as well, and the inclusion, frankly. With that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and we're going to chat a little bit more.
Wow.
Yeah.
Jeez. My goodness.
So,
I think, Lizzie, I was most surprised with the Dove campaign, because I think they had been lauded for doing a good job of being inclusive. I missed that one that you showed. I didn't realize that they also had missteps as well.
yes, and Dove is a really interesting case study for that reason, that there was such duality in their marketing. They were saying one thing and doing a very different thing, and you can see the very real impact of what happened when they got it right, and then what happened when they got it wrong. And so these are examples that really demonstrate when you get it wrong, you offend customers, you may lose them permanently, and you're doing long-term damage to your brand and to your bottom line. So I'm curious, in the sake of kind of candor, if any of you have made missteps in your marketing campaigns that you could share or feel comfortable sharing.
Not like that.
Fair enough.
You know, I think it's interesting though that you have to wonder, because some of those things are so blatantly offensive. Is it really those, you know, we're talking about unconscious bias so much now. So having those conversations and those trainings and those things around, you know, were you really trying to be that offensive, or do you really just not think about what you're doing? And that's why DEI programs really need to have a focus around marketing, communications, those things, because that bias is taking place there too. And that's reflected here. Now, you know, unless they're trying to be overtly racist and offensive, who knows? But I tend to doubt it in a lot of cases, that they thought this is okay, what's wrong? Until they really realized, you know, you really screwed up just because of those things that you think are okay and they're not. So
yeah, I think you're right. I mean, these aren't necessarily bad people who created some of this content. They made bad choices, and they were allowed to make bad choices because of the, you know, to use the word ecosystem again, the ecosystem in which they lived. I mean, I can't think of a specific example, Lizzie, but as I think back to when I was first working in the Bay Area and in Silicon Valley, we just didn't have these conversations. Mm-hmm. And, you know, so there was never anything egregious like we saw, but we just weren't having those conversations about, you know, who or where we should be showing up. And I mean, and it still is largely, the technology world is dominated very much by white men. And so now the difference is, in a lot of those campaigns, just as an aside, it points to the challenge of building a global brand, because a lot of those campaigns happened in different markets around the world. And so if you're a CMO in a global HQ, whether that's in the United States or somewhere else, you know, part of your challenge is, how do you create and communicate the essence of your brand in ways that are culturally relevant in those markets? So it's easy to point a finger back to Unilever HQ or somebody else, but in many respects, those decisions were made in different markets where cultural norms might be different, or where they are not as evolved in the expressions of what it means to be a multicultural or an inclusive marketer. So it's a real challenge, because now, of course, 20 years ago, you may never have seen that ad that goes, you know, flies in the face of what you're saying at corporate HQ. But now, of course, nobody knows the difference. It gets posted on social. It might as well be in the middle of New York City as in another market somewhere around the world. So it's really interesting the extent to which we still see these disconnects on a massive global scale, and it all comes back to bite the leaders of organizations. It's not, you know, it's not easy.
Can I share another disconnect? I'm sorry, from a client that I had before, just kind of as it's a different kind of disconnect, but still a disconnect. So they created this wonderful campaign focused on targeting same-sex couples, and it was a car dealership. And so the campaign was fantastic. It was amazing. So you have all these same-sex couples coming to the dealership to purchase the cars. But when they got to the dealership, the experience was so negative. So the people that they were dealing with, you know, they spent all this money, millions of dollars on this ad, but it hadn't filtered through to the people that are actually dealing with their customers on a day-to-day basis. So that campaign fell totally flat. They did everything right from a campaign perspective, but when it came down to making sure that DEI was infiltrated through your entire organization, they failed miserably and lost a bunch of money. So again, it's an ecosystem, right? And Sharon's point, it's a process. It's more than just an ad.
Yeah.
That's such a significant point too. And I think that we've all, yes, it's so important that it is not merely that checkbox, that moment, that campaign. It is the full experience end to end, that is both external for the user, but then internal for how you then support it once that user connects with your brand. I think that's absolutely theme of the day and what we're seeing. Sharon, can you share a little bit about, you know, we've talked about how people react in the short term, but how do you advise clients that have made that misstep? What do you do if that occurs for your brand? And from a PR perspective, what are your thoughts there?
Well, I think what's important to recognize is we all know now marketing is so digital. And so you can make corrections. And first of all, admit to your mistake. Don't just remove the ad and pretend it didn't happen, because someone has screenshotted it or screenshot it, right? Someone will have a copy of it. So admit to your mistake and then do better. And that's just, and the beauty of it is you can say, hey, we know we got it wrong, but we're here to do better. And then show what you're doing to do better. I wanted to share with you a really cool app that it's a company that we worked with in 2017 called Gender Fair. Now it's more specific about their whole mission is to get gender equity. And I would actually love now 3 years later to talk to them about expanding more than gender equity, but all multicultural equity. But one of the things what they did, this Gender Fair app, it's 3 women who used to be CMOs at Fortune 500 companies, left their positions to start Gender Fair as a company. And what they're doing is grading companies, and they're using Fortune 500 companies or publicly traded companies because they can get the information publicly. And they go through and they grade each of these companies. What does their leadership look like? How many women and people of color are on those boards? Then they go through and look at what the policies are for these companies. Do they have not only maternity leave, do they have paternity leave? Then they look at the marketing. So here's where we are. And what does their marketing look like? Like, for example, Hardee's. If I see one more woman in a thong bikini laying on top of a sports car moaning as she eats a burger, a thick burger, I have not been to Hardee's since they started that campaign. Right? Now, they doubled down on it. Good for them, whatever. I'm not their market. However, they look at so Gender Fair grades the marketing. And then one other piece, which I think is important for us to recognize, is philanthropy efforts. Where are these corporations giving money? So here's what happens. And I think you can see it. They will go through and score the companies A through F on each of those categories. And here's where we make the difference. You as the consumer can go on to this app and decide where you're spending your money. If you have a cell phone plan that's coming up for renewal, don't just go in and, renew. Go onto the Gender Fair app and look and see which of the companies has the best for gender equity and multicultural equity, and spend your money there. That's the only way we're going to make a difference. On the consumer side, spend the money of the brands that are getting it right. So I just did a nice ad for Gender Fair, but it's free. It's a free app. And I think we all can be doing something like that. I would love for the diversity movement to have our own little mark where we can put, just like a USDA 100% certified organic. Let's make sure that we can work with the brands that are supporting the issues that we support and that are being equitable in their marketing.
You bring up such an excellent point too, because it ladders back so much with Gen Z and that consumer base that is currently coming about, entering the workplace, and how they have different expectations for brands, frankly. So there's this increasing movement of insisting that companies do more than just sell. Successful companies need to give back, make a difference. What is that impact? And actually that alignment strengthens the brand position and works in tandem with the marketing itself. And again, goes back to the ecosystem of how all these things are connected to one another and really meaningful and kind of determining what consumer decisions are, frankly. Excuse me. With that, I want to take a moment. I think I want to wrap up in a few minutes, so we're going to skip a couple questions so we can open the floor for questions and kind of chat with everyone attending. So start thinking about your questions. But in terms of just as a final piece for our panelists, can you speak a little bit about what concrete steps companies should be taking to evaluate their marketing campaigns or their brand positions, and how do you, I think we've spoken a little bit about, that internal and external play for incorporating a more diverse voice, but are there tangible kind of action items that you can align to some of that? Shelley, I will kick it to you first.
Just at a very basic level, right? Think about who makes up your marketing team. So who is sitting around the table making those decisions? And if you don't have someone in creative that looks like the community that you serve, well, then you need to reach out, and you can find a great creative firm that probably can speak more to your market and leverage all of the resources that you have available to you. A focus group maybe to take a look at some of your past campaigns and see what type of feedback that you're getting. Or internally look at your past campaigns and say, okay, let's think about the process. How did we come up with this? Who had this idea? How did we execute this? And really just take a deep dive into how you come up with what you're promoting about your brand. And if you find that and you don't do it with an ethnic lens or with a multicultural lens, you don't have that lens on that's saying, hey, maybe we need to reconsider or do something different here, or this was completely linear thinking that didn't speak to everyone that we serve, we need to figure out how to do it differently. So I could talk all day about this, but yeah, I think but making sure that you have a team of people that are making decisions about your marketing that reflects the community that you serve, or that can speak to those markets.
That's great, thank you. Sharon, you mentioned Gender Fair. Are there any other apps or companies that that you recommend for kind of inclusion?
Sure.
From that?
There is a company called Diversify, and it's DY. Kayla, I think you can put it in the chat. I've mentioned it in our meetings before, diversify.com. And it's about a year old. And what it does is it's almost like Glassdoor for employees of different backgrounds who work at companies, who can then go on to Diversify and say, okay, I work at Apple, and as a minority female, here's what my experience is like. And so people who are looking to come work at Apple can go to Diversify, look up the company that they're interested in working, and find out what's the true experience from an employee's perspective. So I love that Diversify is continuing to add companies and authentic stories that are verified from employees there about what it's like to be, that whatever the different person is working at that company, what their experience is. And I just love that.
Absolutely. Bob, from a global perspective, you talked a bit about like the diversity of that cultural impact, right? And that the accountability and how quickly campaigns move when they misfire. Can you kind of expand a little bit more on how to catch those things and any sort of actionable steps there if you're working in multiple markets?
Yeah, I think it comes back. I think it was Shelley who was talking about the importance of sort of inside out. Right? You have to be really clear within your employee communications about what you stand for as a brand, what your ethics are, how you want to be represented in the market. And the job is just consistent communication. So obviously there are guards you can put in place, there's approval processes, et cetera. But as we've seen, like clearly things get through the cracks. So it comes down to this notion of being super clear about what we stand for as a brand, or what you stand for as a brand, and making sure that people recognize that and hold them accountable for it internally. Because otherwise you will have these massive say-do disconnects, and you'll get caught every time. So, another watchword that we talk about a lot is authenticity. So how do you communicate the essence of a brand purpose in a way that feels authentic to those markets? That's the challenge from a global brand builder's perspective. So I don't know that you're ever going to solve the problem from a command and control perspective, because then you're just going to fall into the same traps. Like, well, just use this image, use this, and it won't be effective marketing. You have to still reach those consumers wherever they are, where they are. And so you have to allow the people on the ground in, whether it's Europe or the Middle East or in the Asia Pacific, whatever, you have to let them interpret the essence of the purpose of the brand with clear guidance about how the choices they make will reflect back on what you stand for as a global brand.
That's great. Thank you. We are headed close to time, so I am going to pick my last question to each of the panelists for answers, which is, what are any of the brands that you admire that are doing this well, and why?
I mean, I'll just go first. I think P&G is a brand that has really stepped up. And to your point at the outset about being vulnerable, I think they've taken some pretty brave moves in terms of, like the famous Talk ad that they did last year, the year before, which spoke directly to the African American experience as it relates to police violence and systemic racism. That's pretty brave for a brand like P&G. So I always look to them as a change maker. They've had their missteps in the past too, but I think that they've been somewhat courageous in how they address some of these issues.
That's
I
great.
would say from a representation standpoint, I think Ulta does a really good job of representing all, gender, sexual orientation, all of those things with their makeup ads. And that, sometimes you'll find that the brands maybe try to subtly reach different audiences, especially as it relates to sexual orientation. You've probably seen very subtle, and sometimes you wouldn't see it if you weren't looking for it. But Ulta has been pretty bold in a lot of their imagery, and saying, "Hey, we see you, our brand recognizes you, and we celebrate you." So I think that's a good move.
I'll say that I just saw this really cool video. Sorry, I was trying to pull up the name of it. Goodness, Canon put together a really cool video recently where they had 6 different photographers take a picture of one person. And each photographer was given a different backstory of the person, and talking about how unconscious bias can completely change the way someone approaches a piece of creative marketing. And it was really, I thought Canon did a wonderful job. By the time you finished watching the ad, you're kind of like holding onto your face going, oh my gosh, I get it. I now understand that the storytelling begins from behind the camera as you approach the message. Because what are those unconscious biases that you're thinking about as you're creating a campaign? And so I would encourage you to look up the Canon, the photography company, the camera company, because they did a beautiful job in that video showing it really makes you think. So they're obviously spending some time around that and thinking about how they're talking about their brand as well.
That's great. I've got one last question for the day from one of our participants. So often as comms marketing pros, we have control over the message, but not necessarily the experience, i.e. Shelley's car dealership story. How do you make sure experience is consistent, even with portions that are out of your hands?
Well, I would just say that starts with that DEI training and at the top, and that filters through the organization. And it has to be something, to Bob's point about what your brand stands for, what your brand promise is. And if you are a part of that organization, that company, that's, if you don't believe in that, then you probably should find someplace else to work. But if it's so strong and so ingrained within the corporate DNA, then when you have your employees that deal with customers, they understand, in this situation, this is how I'm supposed to respond, or this is how I'm supposed to act, because this is the personality of our brand. This is who we are. So it really, we say it all the time, it starts at the top, but it can't stop there. It's got to filter all the way down. And that's where great DE&I training comes in. And of course, a shameless plug, the diversity movement, we're here to help you. So call me so I can help you with that. But yeah, no, it's a, it's not a one-off thing, right? So it's a consistent, if we're talking about leveraging this as a business imperative, then look at all the other things that you look at when you're planning and strategizing with your business. It's not something you do one time. So it's a consistent effort that needs to be repeated and needs to be driven home with your employees.
Great. Anyone else would like to chime in on that?
I mean, I think just building on that, employee comms are critically important. That's all I would say. is you can't, and you have to not only be consistent in the message, but it's repeat, repeat, repeat. And remember that compensation drives behavior. So people need to be held accountable when they're not living the values of the organization. And I think that we haven't always been good as business people, as leaders, doing that, because we've allowed a lot of bad behavior in every facet of business, because performers are the ones doing it. And so, you'll hear some people talk about having a no a-hole policy, but we need to really more positively, oops, that screen just blew up, more positively reward people who truly do demonstrate empathy and compassion and who live the brand purpose every day.
And I would just end with listening. I think, and I'm guilty of this too, I think we could all do a lot better of a job listening and making sure that you're hearing voices, as we've said multiple times today, from every part of the spectrum. And it's interesting, I know that Lizzie, you had wanted to talk about the Gen Z implications and influence on marketing. And very quickly, we were putting together a campaign, and it was a bunch of over 40-year-olds coming up with what hashtag and what are we going to call it on Instagram. And thank goodness my colleague's 12-year-old daughter walked by and said, "What are you people saying? That is not the way young people talk." And she checked us, and thank goodness, if she hadn't walked by, we would have had a campaign that would have fallen flat on its face, because we weren't talking to the people and inviting those voices in. So it's really about listening and asking for feedback.
That vulnerability is so important too, of being willing to kind of get that feedback and elicit it if you don't have that diversity internally to have those voices be heard. So I love that story so much. It's really significant. With that, I will thank each of you for participating in the discussion and the webinar and sharing your lunch hour with us. All the participants who joined, thank you. We hope this has been informative and it's given you some actionable steps on improving your multicultural marketing strategies. For more information on our panelists and their companies, I will share this screen, which pops up preemptively, so you're welcome. At the end of the webinar, you'll also see a 2-question survey appear in your browser. We welcome your feedback and ask that you please take a minute or 2 to answer for the sake of listening. We always enjoy hearing what you thought and working for the future. So thank you so much, guys. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you,
everyone.
Lizzie. Thank you.
Take care.
Happy Tuesday to all.
Be safe. Mask up.
All of that.
Yes.